Okay, ready to dive in? We're tackling a topic that, well, it's been around for centuries, but it's also surprisingly relevant today. Messiah claimants. People throughout history who've, really captured the imagination, sparked movements, left their mark on, well, everything.
Yeah, it really speaks to that human need for hope, right? For someone to lead the way towards something better.
Exactly. And you asked us to unpack this whole Messiah thing, how it's played out across different cultures, different religions even. We've got some really fascinating stuff here from a couple Wikipedia articles. One's a whole list of these claimants. The other's a deep dive on St. Christopher, which we'll get to later. But before we jump in,
Definitions, right?
absolutely. Because Messiah, it tends to make people think of very specific figures, usually within their own traditions, but it's actually a much broader term when you get down to it, right? It's more like an umbrella term, covering anyone seen as a savior, bringing about a new age, that kind of thing. And it's not limited to just one place or time period either.
Our sources actually point us right to the Jewish tradition, which has a very rich and complex history with this concept. For example, the early Jewish idea of a Messiah was quite different from how it developed later on.
Oh, for sure. Early on, you're talking a divinely appointed king, someone in the mold of, like, King David, powerful leadership, political stability, uniting the tribes of Israel. It's a very earthly kind of savior at that point.
Makes sense given the historical context, right? But after periods of oppression, things like the destruction of the Second Temple, the exile that followed, people yearned for something different, a different kind of deliverance.
And that's when this world to come idea starts to emerge, yeah. The Messiah isn't just restoring earthly power, it's a total transformation, a whole new world order.
And this shift, it wasn't just theoretical, it played out in real life, with figures like Simon Bar Kokhba back in the 2nd century.
Bar Kokhba.
Yeah.
Now, he wasn't just talking about a new world order, he was out there fighting for it. Leads a revolt against Roman rule, and get this, some big-time rabbis, they actually declared him the Messiah.
Can you imagine the hope that must have ignited a leader seemingly embodying those very expectations, standing up to an empire?
His story still resonates today, and it's been centuries. It speaks to the sheer power of belief, especially when it's tied to those real-world struggles, that desire for liberation.
It's true, but, and it's important to note, the Bar Kokhba revolt, it ultimately failed, crushed by the Romans. And this had a huge impact on how Jewish messianic expectations would develop. After a defeat like that, well, there's a noticeable shift. How these figures are viewed, even what makes a true Messiah, it's all debated even more.
Like the stakes got higher, the need to define true messiahship became more urgent. Which brings us to a pivotal figure, one whose story emerges from this exact context, Jesus of Nazareth.
A figure who, while deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, ends up sparking a whole new religion.
And it's interesting, the way the source points out this early evolution. Jesus' followers, they weren't called Christians at first, they were Nazarenes.
Followers of Jesus of Nazareth, yeah, seems kind of obvious in retrospect, but it shows you how these movements, these identities, they form gradually. They're still practicing Judaism, believed Jesus was the Messiah, and that group, they became known as Jewish Christians. Essentially, the very first Christians. That connection is key to understanding where early Christianity comes from.
Has a lot of layers to those early debates, doesn't it? It wasn't two separate religions going head-to-head right away, more like branches growing from the same roots, each interpreting their shared scriptures, prophecies, through their own lens. And this idea, reinterpreting the messianic idea, different figures claiming that mantle, it keeps popping up. Take Sabbatai Zevi, 17th century rabbi, who declares himself the Messiah.
And Zevi's story is fascinating because it doesn't end with his death, or even his conversion to Islam when he was pressured.
Right. Even after he's gone, this whole line of self-proclaimed messiahs pops up, all claiming lineage back to him, like a spiritual chain reaction.
It highlights something really important. Messianic belief, it doesn't just exist out there on its own. It creates space for new interpretations, sometimes even rivals, all drawing on similar traditions, but each offering a different way forward.
Which brings us to someone much more recent. Might not be the first person you think of with the word Messiah, but Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
The Rebbe is fascinating. He shows us that messianic belief, it's not just ancient history, it's very much alive, playing a role in how communities see themselves, how they see the future.
Totally. Even after his death, the debate about him, about whether he was the Messiah, it's still going on. These questions about salvation, the future, they're still a part of how people understand the world.
It really hits home that these aren't just some abstract theological debates, They're deeply connected to how whole communities function, how they see their place in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And this whole idea of reinterpreting those messianic traditions, different people stepping up to claim that role, it's not just a Judaism thing. Our source, it points to a bunch of examples in Christianity too.
Which makes sense when you think about it, right? Christianity, it's got all this diversity in how people interpret things, especially when it comes to the end times.
Right. Eschatology, right. Beliefs about how the world ends, judgment day, second coming of Christ. It's like prime territory for different interpretations. And those interpretations, they can have a real hold on people. Like our source mentions Sun Myung Moon. He founded the Unification Church. He believed he was finishing what Jesus started, bringing in this new spiritual era.
And then you've got Apollo Quiboloy over in the Philippines, leads a group, calls it the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, claims to be the appointed Son of God, the one chosen to carry out God's work.
It's kind of wild, right? These movements, these interpretations of what a Messiah is, they go global. Shows you how powerful these beliefs are, how they resonate across cultures, across continents even.
It's also a good reminder, though. Critical thinking, it's important. Got to approach these claims carefully with a discerning eye, you know.
Oh, for sure. Belief systems, they can be deeply personal, yeah.
Yeah.
But we got to be aware of how those beliefs are being used, especially when it comes to things like power, authority, and, well, potential harm.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting category of messiahs, ones who blend together multiple traditions. We call them syncretic messiahs.
Syncretism? There's a word to unpack for you listeners. Basically, it's mixing different belief systems together, taking parts of different religions, making something new. And one example that jumps out from our source, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith.
What's so fascinating about Baha'u'llah is the sheer scale of his claims. He wasn't just saying he was fulfilling prophecies in one religion. Oh no, he was talking about 6 major ones. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
Talk about ambitious. He's positioning himself as this unifying figure, embodying the truth at the heart of all these different faiths.
And that desire to find common ground, to use a messianic figure to bridge the gaps between different religions, not unique to the Baha'i faith, speaks to a very human desire for unity, for this sense of connection that goes beyond just what religion you are.
Like finding those threads, right? The ones that connect us all. Weaving together these seemingly totally different traditions to make something new. But our deep dive, it's about to go even further beyond those familiar religious frameworks. Ever think about how messianic figures, they can pop up outside of organized religion altogether?
It reminds you that longing for a savior, someone to bring in an era of peace and understanding, it's universal. It's just part of being human. And our source, it gives us a great example. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia. Now, to be clear, Selassie himself never actually claimed to be Messiah.
Didn't stop others from seeing him that way, though. He became hugely important in the Rastafari movement, a symbol of liberation and black empowerment, especially for people of African descent trying to reconnect with their roots.
It's intriguing, right? How certain people, they just embody those collective hopes and dreams, even when they're not actively trying to. It's about symbolism, how people project their own desires and interpretations onto certain figures.
They become like this blank slate, and entire movements can project their own stories, their visions of a better world onto them. We've covered a lot, haven't we? Ancient kings to modern spiritual leaders, people who sparked revolutions to those who wanted to bring faiths together. It really makes you think, why do we still need a savior today? What is it about that, even now?
It's a question worth thinking about, isn't it? What drives that longing for someone to make things right, to usher in that more perfect world? Is it justice? A need for hope when times are uncertain? Or maybe, like we saw with some of these figures, a desire to be part of something bigger, a story that gives our lives meaning.
Big questions to leave you with. Out of all these stories, what sticks with you? What connections have you started to make in your own mind? From Bar Kokhba to St. Christopher, from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, the search for a Messiah goes on. And hey, maybe understanding those searches in the past can help us understand our own desire for a better future a little better too.
It shows you belief systems, they aren't set in stone, are they? Always evolving, picking up new layers of meaning as they travel through time across cultures. It's really something.
Like a big old game of telephone. But instead of whispering a phrase, it's entire stories, symbols, whole belief systems even. And sometimes those stories, they kind of take on a life of their own. Of course, there's another theory about why St. Christopher is sometimes shown with a dog's head, and it's a lot less, well, mystical, I guess you could say. Some scholars, they think it all comes down to a simple mistake.
Ah, right, the whole Canaanite thing.
Bingo. See, Christopher, he was thought to be Canaanite, but in some medieval texts, that got mixed up with a word that means, you guessed it, canine. So one little slip of the language, and boom, dog-headed saint right there in your iconography.
Good reminder, even when we're digging into these big, sweeping narratives, these claims about the divine and everything, sometimes the best parts, the most interesting stuff, it's in those little details, those quirky little footnotes that make history so much fun to explore.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of fun, we have covered some serious ground in this deep dive. Ancient Judea, modern-day Ethiopia, rabbis declaring messiahs left and right, emperors who became these symbols without even trying. And through it all, this idea, this need for a chosen one, someone to come along and change everything, it pops up again and again. Makes you wonder, why is that? Why do we still long for a savior, even today?
It's a good question to sit with, isn't it? What is it deep down that makes us want someone to fix everything, to bring about that perfect world? Is it a longing for justice, maybe? Or maybe we just need hope, especially when things feel so uncertain? Or could it be, and we saw this with some of the figures we talked about, could it be that we want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, a story that gives our lives meaning,
Now, those are some big questions to leave you with. What about you? What really stood out to you from all these stories? Any connections you've started making in your own mind? Because one thing's for sure, from Bar Kokhba to St. Christopher, from the streets of Jerusalem to Ethiopia, the search for a Messiah, it's still going on. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, if we understand those past searches a little better, it can help us understand our own longing for a better future, too. And on that note, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and as always, keep on diving deep.